Evidence of noise-induced subclinical hearing loss using auditory brainstem responses and objective measures of noise exposure in humans. Source: Hearing Research. Authors: Erika, Skoe, Jennifer, Tufts. Exposure to loud sound places the auditory system at considerable risk, especially when the exposure is routine. The current study examined the impact of routine auditory overexposure in young human adults with clinically normal audiometric thresholds by measuring the auditory brainstem response, ABR, an electrophysiological measure of peripheral and central auditory processing. Sound exposure was measured objectively with body-worn noise dosimeters over a week. Participants were divided into low-exposure and high-exposure groups, with the low-exposure group having an average daily noise exposure dose of 11% of the recommended exposure limit compared to the high-exposure group average of nearly 500%. Compared to the low-exposure group, the high-exposure group had delayed ABRs to suprathreshold click stimuli, and this prolongation was evident at ABR waves 1 and 3 but strongest for V. When peripheral differences were corrected using the IV interpeak latency, the high-exposure group showed greater taxation at faster stimulus presentation rates than the low-exposure group, suggestive of neural conduction inefficiencies within central auditory structures. Our findings are consistent with the hypothesis that auditory overexposure affects peripheral and central auditory structures even before changes are evident on standard audiometry. We discuss our findings within the context of the larger debate on the mechanisms and manifestations of subclinical hearing loss.